Tonight's talk is brought to you by the Sierra College Art Department and the Sierra College Ridley Gallery. The art department at Sierra College offers 2 associate degrees in studio art. It is our goal to make the arts available to students through historical surveys and the studio experience. We see nearly 30 degree graduates each year and almost 200 majors in any given semester. The Ridley Gallery, or College Art Gallery, is located on the Rockland campus, complements and expands the educational environment of Sierra College and the community by featuring an exceptional range of arts programming. With school closures, exhibitions have moved to an online format. Currently on view is Prologue, an online exhibition featuring a sampling of the works of your professors, Angelina Coughlin, Vincent Pacheco, and me, Jennifer Lugris-Packer. You can view the exhibition on the Ridley Gallery's website. This spring, we're excited to have our 23rd annual juried student exhibition. It will be held entirely online and will be juried by tonight's speaker, Aida Lizalde. Information and link for submitting work will be available on the Sierra College Ridley Gallery's website the first week of April, and I'm sure your teachers will be sharing it with you as well. Submissions will close on April 28th, so keep that date in mind, and then they will be posted online the first week of May. There's no entry fee, and you get a chance to win cash awards, so I highly encourage you to submit some of your amazing work. So this is the first year that the Ridley Gallery and the Art Department are collaborating in an initiative to bring real life artist examples to our students in an effort to inspire you and prepare you for artistic careers beyond college. So it is an honor to introduce our first artist of the speaker series, Aida Lizalde. I first met Aida through a critique group in Sacramento. I was immediately impressed with her work, specifically a piece she did about her mother called Cheli es Santa. In that performance, Aida precariously sits on a broken chair that will collapse as soon as she stands. The chair includes etchings of verbally abusive phrases that over time painfully leave imprints on her naked flesh. The idea of seemingly holding it together externally while you're hurting and falling apart internally really stuck with me. Aida is an award-winning artist who has had multiple notable exhibitions throughout California. She is an immigrant from Mexico who started her educational journey at community college, graduated from UC Davis, and was now accepted to one of the best Masters of Fine Arts programs in the country, Virginia Commonwealth University. Congratulations. Her work is about her experience assimilating to the US and obtaining citizenship, which I know is not easy. As a daughter who witnessed her parents go through the process, it's refreshing to see work from an artist who has put these voices into gallery spaces and museums where they've been historically underrepresented. Perhaps what most impresses me about Aida is how she manages to overcome any challenge that gets in the way of achieving her goals. Thus, she is a role model for many. Aida, it is a pleasure to have you here at Sierra College. I am so excited. Thank you so much for being here. I will now turn the mic over to you.
Wow, this is like the first time I almost cry with an introduction. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone that is here. There's a lot of people here. I really appreciate everyone's participation. And I'm actually really excited to be giving this talk because, like Jennifer said, I went through community college, and now I am going on to a master's degree program. But I've been where many of you are. I have been wanting to be an artist since I was in high school, and I stuck through it to many years of college, transferring, and like a few years after graduating from my bachelor's. I am gonna put my headphones on because I am at my studio right now, so there might be noise coming from the other shops. Just 1 second. And I hope you all can hear me. And now I'm gonna start presenting. So I wanted to start my slideshow with some of the work that I did when I was in community college. Just 1 sec right here. And everyone can see this now.
Yeah, so here's my website if anybody's curious about more of the work. I am keeping this slideshow very PG, so a lot of my performance work is not there, if it includes nudity, and just like performance work in general, I kind of avoided because I'm taking a little break from it, but feel free to go dig through my website and see some of the other projects that I've done and some of the other work if you're over the age of 18. But I have mature content warnings and everything. So when I started making artwork, like many of you, I started drawing and painting when I was in high school. And I was very encouraged by one of my high school teachers in Stockton. Her name was Miss Utsui. She passed away recently of cancer, unfortunately, but she was one of the very first people that made me feel welcome, very, very welcome in a space. It was pretty hard jumping in as a sophomore into high school and not fully having a grasp of the English language. So the art classroom was where I felt the most relaxed. You know, I didn't really have to express myself a lot with words, and I could just make things. And my teacher was also bilingual, so that really helped. And she encouraged me and my twin sister, who's also very artistic, to pursue this career in the arts. And she helped us apply for like the California Summer School for the Arts and Cal Arts, etc. But I mostly did drawings and paintings then, and it wasn't until I started going to community college that I started focusing on three-dimensional work. And because I'm an immigrant and my family moved a lot, I went to several community colleges. I started out at Delta College and I went there for 2 semesters. And then I went to Modesto Junior College, and then I finished my associate's degree for transfer at Sac City College. So some of you also take classes there with like Joya Fonda and Terry Peterson, and I was there a few years ago. And when I was there, I really, really focused and honed on sculpture. And these are some of the pieces that I made when I was there that are mixing medias. I was really interested in ceramics, and ceramics has always been a comforting media for me, something that I always go back to, something that feels really good, you know, and something that is also very versatile. And I've been able to do like different kinds of work with. And before, I used to be interested in more figurative and representational work, and that's changed, but you'll see a little bit about that here. So this series of works were kind of about me thinking back into my childhood and feeling like a lot of my childhood was spent in this sort of trance where the world was something separate from me, and my sister and I kind of had like our own little world and spent a lot of time daydreaming. And these are made out of ceramic, wood, contact crayon, and acrylic paint. Um, the next two pieces are also figurative, but I was starting to kind of like go a little bit further into what does it mean to make a self-portrait and what does it mean to like represent the self, and still using ceramics, but just kind of like pushing that concept a little bit outside of just something representational. So these pieces are, one of them in the left side is ceramic, and it also contains some textiles and wire, and that's a self-portrait. And then the one on the right is also a self-portrait, and it's called Conciencia. And the part in the head is actually raku fired, so it has this like wonderful metallic colors. And this is the kind of like switch in between. Like I was doing figurative work when I was in community college, and then I started learning how to throw on the wheel, and then I transferred to UC Davis, and this is one of the first kind of concrete series of work that I did at UC Davis. And I don't know if you can see the figure here in a literal way, but there is a figure, and it's a figure that is kneeling on the ground. So when I was in UC Davis, I started kind of thinking about the figure in a different way. How can I represent something that is like the human body, and not do it so literally as to just represent the human body? So I did a series of work that is just called Clay Body. And in this series, I gave myself certain rules where because we had access to tons and tons of clay, we just had like a giant pile of clay at UC Davis, and we could just grab from it. That was sometimes a little overwhelming, but it was also really exciting because you just had a lot of material to work with. So I decided that I was gonna make some sculptures that use my body somehow to make them, not just my hands. So in this figure that's called Origins, I actually coiled the clay around my body, and I gave myself a rule that I was only going to work on it while I was inside of it. So I couldn't like go and fix it or anything if I was outside. So this piece was completely done. The building of the clay was completely done while I was like inside of it, like kneeling in it. So I would get to the studio and I would make a bunch of coils first, and then I would just sit in that position, which could be really painful and like labor intensive, and then just like put coils and coils and coils. And this piece, I wanted to use this kind of motive of like the pose of the body, because for me really spoke a lot about femininity. And I called it Origins because he was centered on this idea that that this kneeling pose is something non-Western, something that a lot of other cultures are more used to doing. You know, like people put their bodies in this position to like make a fire, to cook, or to wash their laundry in the river, or to give birth, or to like gather things. Like, so this position was something that was kind of like foreign to me, but it was also really familiar in some ways. And to me, it somehow represented femininity because of the birthing kind of quality of like other cultures, how they birth, or prior to like Western medicine, how birthing was done in that position as well. And in a way, I also wanted to elevate it, because I was creating a difference between like something that is really low and grounding and something that is elevated, which is like the background that I come from. So this was, you know, the first kind of like series where the body was taking a different form. As you can see right here, I was kind of leaving some vestiges of like actual like figurative work, like by just like carving in it. But other than that, the piece was just kind of an abstracted shape that could fit around my body. This was the other work that I made that was in relationship to that one. So this one is called Siluetas, and it was very inspired by an artist called Ana Mendieta. And she was a Cuban refugee who came to the United States in the 70s, and she studied in Iowa, and she was kind of a revolutionary figure for video art and performance art. And she only lived until she was like, I think in her like mid to late 30s. And you can read a little bit more about it, but she's been one of my heroes. And the way that she uses like ritual in her own body and like very potent things like blood really inspired me. So in this piece, I made a box, and then I sat in the box, and then all of the gaps that my body left kind of empty, that's where on the top side of it, where you see like the three figures that are a little more rounded, those were like the gaps that my body left when I sat on this box with my legs slightly spread open. And then the clay parts that are like closer to you, like on the bottom of the screen, those were actually like the gaps of my body if I was kneeling on the box. So I felt like those were also two kind of like a juxtaposition of two concepts of like growing up Catholic, you know, and like having to like kneel and be religious and kind of having this like submissive way of like carrying your body, and then also having this more like defying like openly sexual, like your legs are open, just kind of sitting there, part of your body. And I wanted to just capture that in the absence of the body, and capture that in the what is surrounding it and what is like making the shape of it. And then I decided to put this on sand, because I originally wanted to display them outside, but this was part of like my schoolwork, so I needed to present it in this way in the classroom at TV9. So I put them in sand because I felt like this kind of helped this idea of a body being there, but being represented by its absence. So you can see like this gestures in the sand of where I had put these pieces down, and then I put my body inside of them, and then I got up, and then there was like this kind of like marks that were done by my body. Something really beautiful about working in TV9 is that we get to make our own glazes. So I just wanted to show up a little bit of that. The inside of this is a slip, and the outside is like this honey glaze that I made. And all the glazes that I was working in this series were very focused on iron, because I wanted that relationship to the body and the blood of, you know, like how I was speaking about Ana Mendieta. So everything was iron based. And these two pieces were called for throwing and for rising. So as you can tell, these are little fists, and something that I would do when I would get into the studio just to kind of like start getting creative was just like start doing gestures with the clay and with my body. And that was something that was really important to my practice then, to incorporate like what does your body automatically want to do when you're touching a material. So these fists were kind of a meditative thing that I would do. I just make a bunch of them, and then I ended up deciding to actually use them for a couple of installations and artworks. These boxes are made out of MDF. I made them also. I was really proud of them because I made them fit exactly in the center block. But the fists that are inside of them were representative of kind of like this battle, this kind of like division of race here in the United States, that I've always felt really heavily because I didn't quite grow up with that. Coming into the United States, like automatically having to be a Mexican woman when I had grown up just being like a normal person that didn't have to identify as Mexican. Like I just happened to be Mexican, but it wasn't something that was so kind of like ingrained in my persona until I came here. Then and also seeing like all this, you know, discrimination that was happening and understanding that dynamic in the United States was something that I'm still doing, of course. But in this artwork, I wanted to represent the fist and how the fist represents so many like different things. Like so for the Black community, the fist is a symbol of power and resistance, and for white people the fist is a symbol of violence and like transgression. So I kind of wanted to there were some protests at the time as well, and I wanted to represent kind of like how there were those piles of bricks and people could just grab them and throw them, and how there's like two different ones, you know, there's one that you can pick up and like lift and as a form of resistance, and then there's another one that you can pick up to hurt someone. So I put these ones that were much lighter, kind of like that little representation of whiteness. And then I stained those ones with the iron stain also to kind of represent that like blood and violence that there was. This is a close-up of the ones that have the iron on them. This piece, I actually ended up destroying it, but I just wanted to show a photograph because, like I said, it was really fun having so much clay. And this was actually a cocoon, and this was another piece that I worked inside of. So I would make a bunch of coils, and this one was actually standing up. So I would get into the studio, and then I would like make my coils, and then I will make a cocoon around myself. And I could only work in it when I was inside of it. So then it got a point that I couldn't really reach inside, so I had to put like this little ladder of bricks, so I have to like get inside of it really carefully. And then eventually my friends that were also at TV night closed like completely, and then I had to break it to come outside of it, and I was inside of it for maybe about 20 or 30 minutes, and it was a really wonderful experience that I recommend to everybody. I know that there's a few different artists that have made cocoons, and I feel like if you have the opportunity to do something like that, you should, because it really gets you close to the clay as a material, you know, that like the coldness of the clay, the humidity of the clay, and then also something very comforting about it, and that is related to the body also. So it's a really cool piece that ended up getting destroyed, but the experience was really wonderful. This is another piece that's just called Blood Fist, so it is more of those. I found this really beautiful um, piece of metal that was rusted, and I just kind of like put it in there in relationship to the glazes and in relationship to this kind of like decay and the bones that were kind of represented in this fist also. It's one of my favorite pieces, I think, just because I really like that metal that I found, and that was one of the times that I was also starting to incorporate more mixed media into my ceramic work and seeing how that would work. And I felt like in this piece it really kind of tied it together because the glazes were so relatable. Like here are a little bit of the close-ups of it. Oh, and then this one. So about that time when I was really interested in the body, I also started getting really interested in performance work. And although I'm not really showing any performance, a lot of the work that I still do is related to performance. A lot of the sculptural work that I have made is either like a vestige of like some sort of gesture with my body, or something that relates to the body or relates to like the body experiencing something in the world. And as you know, like as I like went through the college experience and everything, obviously there was like the stress associated with that, but also you know, like I have anxiety like many people out there, and I clench my jaw at night. So having this kind of like body experience that was very visceral and kind of like almost terrifying, and I wanted to represent that in some way with my work. So what I did is that I did this performance piece, and I call it a performance even though it wasn't really for anyone to see. It was just like this performing gesture that I was doing, where I made a bunch of balls of clay and then I was biting onto them to kind of like leave the impression of my teeth in them. And teeth are something that is very fascinating, and something that everybody has like some sort of like relationship to, you know, like if you've had a root canal, or if you've had any sort of like like pain, that's something that is very overwhelming. And because the American healthcare system is so screwed up, I feel like a lot of people don't really have dental insurance. So that's something that a lot of people kind of suffer through. So that's something that I've suffered through. I didn't have health insurance for most of my life here. So like teeth are always something that's kind of like terrifying, not only in a way because they're creepy or whatever, or because it's like a part of the body that detaches from the body and you can see outside of it, but also because it's something that's kind of scary, you know, when you have tooth pain or when you have issues with it and you can't take care of them. It kind of like puts you in this kind of like marginal space where you're just like cannot take care of your health, and that's a scary space to be. So this piece was very much about all of those things, in a very subtle way. But I sat there and I chewed on the clay and I put my teeth marks in it, and it was a very gross experience. Like I'm sure that if you've accidentally like had some sort of like dirt on your mouth or like have chewed on something that had like dirt on it, that you've experienced that kind of like grittiness and the kind of crystals that are inside of it. So I had like a toothbrush, so every time I would bite into it I would like just rinse my mouth and have a toothbrush around. But I created this piece with a found object as well, and I really like this object. I think it's like a jewelry holder that I found, and it had all these like really wonderful speckles of iron, because of like the metal part that was on the top that I was really attracted to because of that kind of blood sensitivity. Like the iron stains were something that I really liked. And in this piece, I was also playing with the same idea, but then I was thinking a lot about the commercialization of the work. When you're an artist, there's always kind of like um, this like quiet conversation about like the art market and like how does your work fit into this market, or how does your work become something that can be commercial, especially if you're not a painter. There's always this kind of lingering question of like, you make all these objects and then what, you know, if you're not making works that are intended to be sold, then what is of them, like, you know. So in this artwork I was really thinking about like, what, I'm a sculptor and I you know, I make this stuff that is not necessarily to be sold, but what if I did make something that was to be sold, and something that's like packaged and manufactured. So I kind of made these smaller sculptures that were still speaking about like me and my identity in a subtle way, but that they were kind of like proposed as something that could like be grabbed and picked up and purchased. So these artworks, in the top one, these are all found objects, like random plastic things that I had like laying around, and I made these flautas. So I don't know if you're all familiar with Mexican food. Like flautas are like what people call like taquitos, like you know, if you get like the junky like microwavable one, but they're just like the deep fried tacos that are rolled. um, so I made these flautas, but when I put them together, I also felt like I really liked that they almost looked like a labia, like the female parts. So I arranged them in such a way that they kind of represented both things. And I laid them on a bed of wool. And wool was another material that I was really interested at the time, because I had just finally been able to visit Mexico, and my grandpa had sheep, and he had all these wonderful textiles that when this family would come and take all the wool from his sheep, and then they would make my grandpa all these like things with it. And I was just like really fascinated by this relationship that my grandpa had with his family, that would just like take the wool and make him a bunch of blankets and whatnot. And I just thought the wool was just like kind of like part of my family in some way. And I like laid them on that. And as you can see in the bottom, there's also a fist again, and another little like pebble that has like a teeth mark. And then on this other piece, there's actually like a ear. So like I just made like a small slab of clay, and then I was just like squeezing it on my ear. And those were this kind of gestures that I used to make at the studio. And I have a lot of work, like random parts here and there, where like I squeezed my face onto like a piece of clay, and then it didn't end up making it into an artwork, or it did, but I just never photographed it. But it's something that I constantly do, like punching something, like throwing clay, squeezing it on your face, like biting it, just like having this kind of exploration with your body. And clay was something that was really important then when I was in TV9 and in the studio. You can see a little bit closer like the indentation of my ear and like the teeth marks on that one. um, oh yeah, and then when I was in Davis in 2017, I was really lucky to get into an artist residency. And if you all want to be artists and continue to have like this as a career, I would highly recommend doing artist residencies. They're really they're really cool. I went to Vermont Studio Center, and I got a fellowship, so I was really lucky I didn't have to pay because I didn't have that kind of money. A lot of people think that residencies are just kind of like fancy vacations artists going to, but there's actually a lot of resources out there for people that can't just afford to like take a fancy artist vacation. And Vermont Studio Center is one of them. They have tons of scholarships and fellowships. So it's a 4-week program, and they give you a studio, and they gave me a room to stay in, and then they also fed me like 3 times a day, which was incredible, and the food was really good. But Vermont is a really wonderful place, so I would take a lot of hikes when I didn't really know what to do at the studio, and I found this really weird mushroom, or what I thought was a mushroom, and I did a little bit of research on it, and it actually is not a mushroom. It's a plant that doesn't have chlorophyll. They're colloquially called Indian pipes, because once they start to fall a little bit, like the flower starts to like lower itself and it looks like a little smoking pipe. This is when they're young, so their little flower still hasn't dropped. But basically, these are a parasite that mooches off of mushrooms, which are also mooching off of trees, right? So it was just like this extra layer of kind of like survival. So there, there's these tree roots, and these tree roots are feeding this like mycelium, and the mycelium is feeding this plant that doesn't have chlorophyll. That's also kind of strange and looks like it's from another planet. And for some reason, I mean, obviously it was very fascinating just on its own, but I think it was also really fascinating for me because I felt like those layers in some way represented me. Like we're here and we're in native land. This is Nisinan land. But then there's like the white culture on top, right? And then there's the immigrants on top. So then there's all these like layers of people who are like surviving and have economies and cultures, and then just like networks that are all connected. In some way, I felt like this like plant looks so alien and foreign represented that in this like very interesting way in the world of biology. So then, inspired by this plant, I started making these pieces, and this was in Vermont also. So I combined the idea of this alien plant with also the idea of borders, because borders were in my mind a lot at the time. This was 2017, and that's when they started having a lot of those like white supremacy like marches, and I was just like really upset by it. And I was just thinking about just like borders and like arbitrary borders, and what it is to inhabit land, and what it is to take ownership of land or make a claim of land. And I used to walk around from my studio to the main dining hall at Vermont Studio Center. There's this beautiful river, and there was this rock, and everyone would go sit there and read. It was like a really beautiful place. And there was just like this kind of gross puddle, and I was really fascinated by the puddle because it looked different every day. Sometimes it had moss, sometimes it was more dry, sometimes it had like this like beautiful greens and whatnot. But I was like, I'm gonna claim that puddle as mine. And I made this kind of surrounding thing around it, and it was made out of terracotta coils that had been fired, and also unfired clay. So it was very temporary because it rained a lot there, especially in the late summer, and I was there in August. So I knew that it wasn't going to last, but it was just like kind of one of those things that I made because I was like, I'm going to claim this puddle as long as I can claim it. So I went and I made this surrounding thing around it with some clay, and I photographed it, and this was my puddle. And what was really interesting about it was that it kind of did look like a country. It was just like this little like, you can see like a state or a country looking that way. And then eventually, some of the coils started like falling over, and then it rained, and some of the clay like kind of disintegrated, which was also part of it because I felt like borders were so ethereal and like ephemeral and like arbitrary. Like for us, maybe something like a border may seem like so daunting and scary and definite, but it's really not. If you've been to the actual border, you can see that it's like rusty and falling apart in some parts and has to be like put back together. So that was something that I was just thinking about. And here's like a little larger view. And then I took this idea, which I ended up calling ajena. Ajena means foreigner. I guess it's roughly translated as foreigner, but not quite. It's almost like if somebody in Spanish tells you like en casa ajena, it means that like you're in somebody else's home, which is like that awkwardness, like the first time you go to your friend's house or something. So that's kind of what ajena means, like to me. It doesn't quite mean foreigner. It just means that you're like inhabiting something that doesn't quite belong to you. And I brought it back when I came back to California, and I wanted to keep exploring this idea of arbitrary borders. So I went to the Yolo bypass, which is like that bird sanctuary, like from Sacramento to Davis. Like you probably driven through it if you have driven that way. Um, and I went there, and I just thought that was like a really wonderful space because it's kind of like wetland, but everything's kind of mushed together, and there's dry parts and wet parts and lots of birds. And I didn't ask permission for this because I had been trying to get permission for a few other like outdoor things when I was a student at Davis, and it was very um, lengthy process, and like I felt like I never could get any answer who could give me permission to do such things. So I did like a few gorilla ajenas around Davis, like in the bike path and stuff, but I really like this one because it was one of the longer ones. And this one was really interesting too because I was making a division between the water and the land. And at the time I also made a performance piece that was called La Bruja y el Agua, and that was during there's been like a year-long fight for like the delta tunnels, and a few of my friends from Stockton that I worked with in the magazine were part of like the Save the Delta nonprofit, and they were advocating against the building of the tunnel. So like water was really present in my mind at the time because water was one of those things that I felt like people with power would take. And then a lot of time people of color didn't really even know how to advocate to like have clean water, to like respect the water sources that we have, and all that stuff. So I was thinking about that division of like how to like how to take the water, and this was a way of like really arbitrarily showing you can't divide the water from the land, you can't take the water for one. Like this is something that it's a symbolic gesture where I'm like dividing it, but it's like so fragile and small, and you can kind of just hope over it. So I was kind of talking about the sense of like the density of nature and how like we're trying to make these gestures and this like policy, but it just seems like the things that we do to take it are so arbitrary in a way. And then of course speaking about borders still, and what does a border mean and what does it do? Like this is like separating the water from the like why, how, and um it was just like one of those things that I was thinking about a lot. And it was also just like in a way I was exploring gestures that I could do that were very large and then very small at the same time. Something that I was doing that would like be really easy, something that didn't take a lot, because I was also easily overwhelmed by a lot of the projects and thoughts that I thought about when I was in school. And then I realized that sometimes it's okay to just do something really simple. So I was giving myself permission to just do something like put a bunch of like coils on the ground, and then being able to like feel some comfort in that. And I hope that you can all too, because it could be overwhelming to try to think of things as an artist, and giving ourselves permission to do something simpler and tone it down or like call something done is very important. Um, so yeah, after Ajena, I have a lot of ceramic stuff in here just because I know that some of you all might be interested. But after Ajena, after I graduated from Davis, I started thinking a lot about my identity, not just as a Mexican person, but as a mestiza. And what mestiza means is that I'm both, European descent and of indigenous descent. And I felt like a really big discomfort with calling myself an indigenous person. And part of the reasons why I felt that discomfort is because I'm lighter skinned, so I could be white passing in some senses, unless I start speaking and then people see that I have an accent. But that was one of the reasons. But another reason was also that when I grew up in Mexico, um, I did not grow up with indigenous culture. I did not grow up in an indigenous culture. I remember walking downtown and seeing indigenous women begging for money or selling bracelets or selling flowers. And I remember thinking of them as like something different. I remember thinking like everybody is a person, but I knew that they were like inditas, which is what we would call them. And it was something really sad to see because there was a lot of poverty. And in Mexico, there's a lot of discrimination against indigenous people. So for me to all of a sudden start claiming this indigenous identity when I had not suffered the erasure and like discrimination and poverty that people who are indigenous in Mexico are facing just seemed inappropriate. And I struggled with that a lot because I had a lot of friends who are both like indigenous and also mestizos here, who were like, it's okay because you do have like indigenous heritage, you know, like I do, like part of me is indigenous and there has been erasure, I just not so direct. So there was always this question, you know, and this question of like, you know, do I consider myself indigenous or not? Like, what are the limitations of that? Is it just genetic? Is it cultural? Does language is involved with that? And this work, it's called binomial, and binomial is just like, you know, binomial. It's like two concepts at once, is neither or. So in this artwork, I basically took what is the Mayan numbers. So you can see this is just like a bead, and then this bead has like three kind of like carved parts and then one in the middle. And this is a Mayan zero. So I was using the Mayan numerology of the zero and the one to represent the, you know, the kind of like computer and technology and the new language, and how like this binary code language that was used to create the technology that we all now communicate with. So I was kind of mixing something really ancient and something really kind of revolutionary for the way that we communicate in language now, and kind of their relationship with numbers, because I wanted to represent that kind of like mestizaje, you know, something kind of Western and something like really ancient and indigenous, the Mayan and the binary code. And in this piece, I actually spelled something, and I spelled no soy indígena, and then I put it on a translator that would translate my sentence into a binary code. So I had like this long list of just like 110 1010, and then I made all these beads of zeros and ones, and then I arranged them into a necklace so that they could spell my sentence in the binary code. So this necklace says no soy indígena, which means I'm not indigenous, like on there. And then there's a lot of leftover beads on the bottom that I still included. This necklace was actually at the Sierra College gallery in one of the shows that Ray curated. I think that was like 2019, if I believe, if I'm right. So some of you might have seen it. And yeah, I'm like getting a little forward. But I made another necklace that also had fists, but I just wanted to talk about that one because that one's really significant to me, and kind of like the struggle that I have about my identity in terms of like mestizaje and indigeneity. And maybe some of you are like familiar with that. But this other artwork also kind of spoke about like my personal experience as an immigrant in the United States, not as a mestiza, but just an immigrant on itself. And this is actually a cyanotype that has been stretched. It's like a big fabric that developed some cyanotype photographs on, and then I stretched it over a piece of wood, and then I created these chips. So it references the game of Loteria, which is like the Mexican bingo that has all the cards, you know, like La Sirena and La Rosa and stuff. And I don't know if any of you are all familiar with the immigration system, but a lot of times in the American immigration system, when you apply for a green card, you get put onto this lottery system. So you might get your green card like, you know, in like 3 years, or you might get it in like 15 years. So a lot of people are just like waiting and waiting for decades to get their green cards. So there's like this idea of like the lottery system, which is like this just like random luck of the draw system to gain legal status in the United States, which I think is so odd. But then also there's kind of like this idea that if you win the lottery, it's like I compare the lottery with the American dream. I was like, if you get all these things, then you will have the American dream, right? And for me, it was like, if you get like if you gain status, and then in order to gain status, you do all this paperwork. If you have a path to citizenship, which many of us don't. So I gather all these photographs that I used to through the process of becoming first a green card holder or a legal resident, and then a citizen. And I used them all, and I created this like tabla, which is what we call the thing. This I did tabla, and I use them to just kind of represent this like game of lottery. You know, like which ones do I have? How many uh, IDs have I submitted? How much paperwork do I still need to get to the American dream? So these were photographs from anywhere from when I was young, and I needed IDs to get my passport to get here, because my family actually came here with a passport and then it expired. But you know, like a photo from school that I required to get my passport, and then after that, like a bunch of different other IDs. So these just kind of like had all the IDs that I have more. This isn't all of them. but it represented a visual history of kind of just like how I've changed as a person throughout this process, and also all the identities that I kind of like inhabited like throughout being in the United States and going through this immigration process. Like I was a Mexican immigrant and I was undocumented, and then I was like a green card holder and a legal resident, and then now I'm a citizen. So it was like what some of those photographs kind of show you all the differences in identity that I had to go through. Just one second. This is just kind of me showing you all how the cyanotype process was done, because I really like this. And just give me 1 second. Um, Sorry about that. So here I just wanted to show the process just because I really like the cyanotype process. And also because it kind of started related to the work that I've been doing more recently. Like kind of like this big panel with images. This is all work from last year, actually. And I went to another residency in Mexico City at this place called Casa Lu, and it's really wonderful. And even before that, I was already working with paper. And the reason why I was working with paper was because I wasn't working as an education manager at Verge Center for the Arts. And when the pandemic hit, we started having to work from home. So we kind of were trying to figure out how to still bring educational programming to people, even though we couldn't gather in person. So we started making this kind of like curriculum for families that have their kids at home now. And one of the things that we were doing was just creating this like PDFs where people can do art projects at home with their kids. And one of them was how to make paper out of other recycled paper. So I started doing the PDF, and then I really liked the process. So then I started continuing to make paper on my own. I really like making paper because it was like something that is readily available. Like we all get those mailers from home, like a bunch of trash, and like we have printouts and all kinds of things. So it was nice to have a material that was like free and readily available, and then just kind of like making these really highly textured objects with it. So I started making these things that are kind of like collages. And when I went to Mexico, I specifically just focused on working with paper. And in this work, I actually have both newspapers from Mexico and then also paper that I had made that has the cempasúchil flowers, which are like the flowers that we use to decorate during the Day of the Dead. So that paper just like was something I really liked and kind of like spoke about my culture in a way that wasn't so literal. And they're just like really beautiful color flowers. So when I was in Mexico, what I was doing was looking for newspapers and then flipping through the newspapers and trying to find how Mexican newspapers represented the United States. So I was really interested on this because, you know, I grew up in Mexico until I was 15 years old. So I wasn't really too familiar into like what the political environment was in Mexico or in the United States when I was younger. But as I've grown older, there's just been the kind of like this impression of like what the media in the United States portrays Mexico as, but I've never got the other side of like, how does the media in Mexico portray the United States? And I also wanted to know what their relationship between the two countries was, like whether that was economic or social, or like just like political in general. Like wanted to see those relationships. So I was looking for those relationships, and you know, like it was to be expected. But what the media in Mexico was portraying United States politics as was just like Trump's face, like everywhere, like overwhelmingly. And talking about like how incompetent like he was, and like the race war, and there were a lot of things that were talking about like Black Lives Matter and how people were protesting. So, or how the Trump administration was dealing with the pandemic and how people were getting, the virus was spreading. So these were the things that I started gathering and kind of putting together. And one of the reasons why I went to Mexico on a residency was to kind of take a break, because it was a really overwhelming year, not just through the pandemic, but because of the protests. And I felt like I had the privilege to take a little break and go somewhere else where there wasn't such like tension. That wasn't just because of the pandemic, it was also because of the social political things that were happening. There was just so much tension, and you can feel it in your body, and you can feel it in your emotions and whatnot. So when I went to Mexico, I was trying to like take a little break from it, but also I was trying to figure out how to process all this information. We were doing like this thing where we are just like constantly scrolling on social media, and it was just not healthy for me to do that. And then I was thinking about how do I get all this information that can be so overwhelming about all these different things and kind of put it in a way that is almost like easier to look at. So I created this format that was inspired by the American quilt, because I was also kind of merging two different things. So it was like the American quilt was something that was just fascinating to me because of like it's such a the quilts are something that was made out of like just random scraps of things, which is what I was doing also with the paper. And the quilts were also a way to like very beautifully arrange things that are different into like one unified design. So I was using this like quilt patterns to, you know, put all this information together, and I created a bunch of them. This one is called muros, and muros means walls. And this one is one of my favorite because aside from flipping through newspapers, I was also walking around a lot in Mexico City. And when you walk a lot around there, you see that there's just like graffiti and posters and weed paste everywhere. And because Mexico City is a city that's really humid, and there's lots of changes in like temperature, a lot of those weed pastes are coming off of the walls. So I started appropriating some of them and also including them in the work that I was doing. So here you see some of the handmade paper. You can see some newspaper clippings that are talking about the Trump administration and like the coronavirus and the wall that Trump wanted to build, etc. And you can also see some of like the artwork that this, like, you know, artists were just putting in Mexico City. And then there's this little paintings that are also that I appropriated that are made on this handmade paper that is a traditional paper making style in Mexico that's called papel amate. And then they paint them with this kind of like colorful, very culturally related to like the pre-Columbian time like paintings. So I also took some of those and incorporated them because I was in a way trying to process the present time for myself and also what culture means to me and kind of merging these different things together. So here's another piece. This one is really large, and this one is called Following the White Rabbit. And you can see like a little like white rabbit in the middle, but that was actually the title of an article that I read about this Colombian philosopher that was talking about Latin American decolonial theory back in the 80s. So it was just like a pretty interesting article about him. And I really liked the title that was like, you know, Following the White Rabbit. And I had one of these paintings. So I kind of made that like the center point. And I really liked this piece because it just had so much texture. A lot of the pinks that are in this series of work are inspired by Mexico City also, because when you go to Mexico City, a lot of the way that the city rebranded the metro and the taxi system and a lot of signage is this like bright pink, like Mexican pink that people used to call it, but now we call it Chilango Rosa, because Chilangos are people that are from Mexico City. That's like a slang of what we call people from Mexico City. It could be offensive, but sometimes it's not offensive. But now the pink is called like Chilango pink. And I actually also was using paper from the egg crates because I would go grocery shopping to make my own food there. And they were like these like egg cartons, and the egg cartons here are just like gray. And in Mexico, they're like bright green and pink and purple. So it was something really wonderful to see. And I started using that material and using the colors from it too. And these are also made out of paper mostly. There's some found objects. But yeah, when I was down there and I was making those like really large collage panels, I started getting kind of bored because I'm a sculptor. So, and I was still doing a lot of two-dimensional work, and I was like, how can I like push this a little further? Like, what can I make that is not just like another panel? Because I'm getting a little bored, and I wanted to work in like multiple things at a time. So I started making these bricks, and I think that bricks were just in my mind a lot because when you walk around a city like Mexico City, you're seeing buildings that are you know, if you go to the pyramids and like the ancient sites that are in the city, there's like these pre-Columbian buildings, and then there's like all these colonial churches, and then there's like buildings built in the modern time in the 1960s. So there's like this mixture of all these buildings that are, some of them are really ancient, but they like are very marked in the era that they belong to. And some of them are falling apart because they're really old. Some of them are falling apart because of the earthquake that had just happened recently. And there was a lot of debris everywhere. And the debris came from the earthquake, and it also came from like, just being a city that is really old. And it was very inspiring because it's just a texture experience. Like you walk down the street and also there's all this debris that's just been like flattened because they don't, they didn't pick it up. They just like flattened it with the cars. Or there are walls that are just kind of like the paint is just like falling apart. There's like this kind of decay that is really beautiful, that is part of the city, that you don't see in a lot of the younger cities that we have here in California, at least not so evidently. So I was really inspired by that because it spoke about culture in a way that was very cyclical for me. It spoke about like the lack of permanence on things, like how everything is always getting recycled, and how there's all these like parts and pieces that are making this city. Like that city is such a metaphor for just like the world in general, because there's like they've been culture after culture after culture that inhabited that space. So I started making these pieces that were called fragmentos, that were just like these bricks made out of paper that were representing kind of like that cyclical time of um, of the city. And this is, yeah, these are the last works that I want to show you, all the one of the most recent ones. Um, this one has rocks that I collected from very significant spaces that I went to, including Leon Trotsky's house, who was a refugee in Mexico, and also like a bullfighting stadium, because the town that I come from is really famous for bullfighting, and also a little rock from my grandpa's ranch. So they're like, and one of them is from the Plaza of Tlatelolco, which is a very significant plaza in Mexico, where a bunch of students were murdered when they were protesting in the 60s by the military. So there are all these vestiges of like where I come from, not just literally, but ideologically. So this piece I really like, and I made a little box. Um, yeah, this is just another, sorry, it's not loading right. This is a view of how the panels were presented at the Sierra Nevada Gallery, which is the solo show that I have that actually closes tomorrow. But you can still see photos online. Sierra Nevada University is in Tahoe. If anybody's interested, they have a really cool interdisciplinary program for both bachelor's and MFA. So highly recommend to go visit or check it out. Yeah, this is another one of the panels. This one I actually made here, and this is like my photograph of like a school ID when I was in Mexico when I was little. And then from that I started to unify both the ID tabla and then the panels that I was making, and I made this quilt. Like, I was making quilts or referencing quilts, but I was like, why not make an actual quilt? Because textiles are something I'm interested in. So I developed a bunch of cyanotype photographs of different people that I know that are immigrants from various different places and with various different statuses. And I put them together in this quilt that kind of also referenced like the American flag. And I felt like this piece I really like, because having all these people who are like me but different than me around is very comforting. Like having all these immigrants that have shared experiences and also experiences that are really different than mine is just like something really comforting for me. So I felt like a quilt was a very fitting thing for that reason, and also because quilts are made of all these different parts, and so is the United States. I just felt like putting all these like different people together is kind of like creating like the landscape of what is America. So I felt like the quilt was a very fitting metaphor for that, for me at least. Yeah, and that's it. That's it. Here's my website again and my Instagram. I'm gonna stop doing the screen share and see if anybody has any questions. That time was kind of about right. I think maybe I went a little over.
So with that, yeah, does anyone have any questions for Aida? You can either type them in the chat and I can read them to her, or if you feel brave, you can unmute yourself and say them out loud.
Yeah.
Oh, I think there's someone. Oh,
Yeah. Hi.
Oh, go ahead, Stephanie.
Hi, were those paper bricks that you made and paper plaques that were under the stones? Was that what those bricks were made out of?
Yeah. So like the little one that had all the rocks that I
Mhm,
collected, yeah, the
mhm.
bricks that were underneath were made out of handmade paper. And then the cardboard box, it was a handmade cardboard box that I made also. So
Okay, and the ones before that were also the thicker pieces, the thicker blocks were also paper?
Yeah, they were also paper mostly. There's a few real ones that I like squeezed in there. And that piece has been shown at 3 different places. And every time that I show it somewhere new, I kind of walk around and find random pieces of brick and cinder blocks and things that are out there, and I incorporate them, and then I remove them because I had to ship that work from Mexico, so I didn't ship the actual rocks that I had there because they were heavy. But when I presented it here, I found some new ones and put them in there, but they're mostly paper. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can show it again just really quickly. Oh no, where you go? Here. I hope it doesn't just take forever to load. Oh no, I think it's gonna take a while to load. Maybe I can find it here. I downloaded this just in case that the internet wasn't working. So here it is. You see our actual cinder block, and there's like a little brick, a little piece of concrete, some bricks, but everything else is actually made out of paper. Yeah. Those ones are, the base of those is made out of paper. Yeah.
It's still not showing, Aida.
Oh no. Stop share. Screen sharing. There you go. Can everyone see them?
See?
Yeah. So you can see cinder block.
So that's solid paper?
So
Some of
these,
these?
no, actually, they're all hollow. They have armature side. Yeah. That
Oh,
would have taken a
okay.
lot of pulp and would have taken, yeah.
I was
It would have
wondering how
taken a
you got
really
it
long
to,
time to dry. I didn't think that.
I was going to ask if you had to kiln dry that. Okay.
I would.
Okay.
I would like to do that. Obviously for the sake of time, I also, I was at a residency for just 5 weeks, so
Yeah.
I didn't have the time for waiting for them to dry. And Mexico's really humid, so when
Yeah.
I was making paper here, I was just leaving it outside for like 10, 15 minutes, and then it would be completely dry. And then when I was there, it rains every day basically around like 5, like 4 or 5. So I had to like make sure I hung everything outside in the morning, and then took it down by 3 because otherwise it was just gonna get wet and destroyed. So it was funny like making work in different places and how the material acts in different places. Yeah.
Thanks. I love that.
Little,
That one.
this one is like close to my heart. little rocks from everywhere.
Yep.
My mom used to collect gemstones too, so I feel like it kind of references that like thing when you're a kid and you see the little collections of things. Yeah.
I can relate.
So we have a couple of student questions. So the first one is from Morelia Serrano. Being Latina, how did your parents react to you majoring in art?
My parents were pretty supportive. I'm lucky because both of my parents, they studied whatever they wanted to study. They never really had a lot of pressure from their parents for like following any specific career. And I feel like both of my parents were pretty like idealistic. Like one of the reasons why we left from Mexico was because they were they started this like self-sustainable ranch project thing that was eventually like was struggling a lot. So we had to leave because we couldn't make ends meet. But they're very idealistic people. My mom is very artistic. My dad is not. And I feel like they they were okay with it as long as I was going to school and I was like pursuing what I wanted to pursue. They weren't too worried about like me not making money. They live very unusual lives themselves, so they weren't really preoccupied with like me being like I'm sure they would have been proud if I was like a lawyer or something, but one of my brothers is going to law school now, or wants to go to law school now. So yeah, there's also a lot of us, so it kind of gave us a little wiggle room. If one of them is just kind of whatever doing some weird stuff, then at least the other one can study like computer science or something more reasonable. So yeah.
And another question from Naomi Maldonado Perez.
Mhm.
How were you able to get artist residencies? Were they programs from where you studied, or did you have to look for these programs outside of college?
You know, UC Davis did have a few opportunities, but I used to always call them opportunities because they were like either cost money or were just like kind of like weird programs. Like they had like Chautauqua residency, which I didn't apply to, and then they had like the Yale Norfolk residency opportunity, but that was really hard to get into, and it was also really expensive, and they wouldn't cover your expenses. So there were opportunities there, but I was mostly looking on my own. When I went to Vermont Studio Center, I just kind of applied on a whim, and I remember I told one of my professors there, and I asked him for a recommendation letter, and I was like, oh hey, like I'm applying to Vermont Studio Center, can you send me a recommendation letter? And they were like, ooh, that's really competitive. And then I was just kind of like, yeah. Like, so, and then I ended up getting it, which was really great. But it is like, like there are tons of residencies out there. You can find them, there's a bunch of websites. Sometimes you can find them in the California Arts Council website. There's also the Artist Alliance for communities, which is another website. Yeah, there's a bunch of places and databases where you can find residencies. There's actually even on Instagram that I follow that has more residencies that are abroad, but they're all free and they have stipends, and like they post them on there, and there's rolling deadlines. But if you're all interested on residencies, there's definitely a bunch of different. The Call for Entry website has them. Yeah, even I'm sure you can even find them on Instagram. Yeah, so. Oh, I can put my website.
Oh, I put your website already.
Oh, okay.
And I'll add these other residency websites onto the chat too, so students can save them. I
Yeah.
see, Kira, you have a question.
Yeah, I was wondering, how long did it take you to make like that cocoon, the ceramic cocoon that you made that you broke out of?
Yeah.
How long did that take you to make?
I think that was only maybe like 3 weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, something like that. I mean, when I was in Davis and I had the little like studio space at TV9, I was there like pretty much like every day or pretty much like every other day. I did have to wait for like the bottom parts to dry a little bit so that I could keep stacking clay. So I kind of had to pace myself. I couldn't just build it really quickly because then it would just kind of fall on its own weight. But yeah, it probably took about like 2 or 3 weeks. Like, it's a quarter system, so there's like this like feeling of rushing all the time when you're in Davis, so it definitely helped. Yeah.
Then Iana, I don't know if you're still here, but I saw you had your hand raised earlier.
Oh, hi. Hi.
Hey, hi Emma. Thank you for
Hi.
coming.
Nice to see you. I was wondering if I know that you're like heavily influenced by feminists, but you're also like at UC Davis, and I'm seeing Bruce Nauman maybe influence
Yeah.
work, and also that piece. Did it reference Carl Andre at all with using that tile work? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I feel like I wasn't really thinking about Carl Lander per se when I was making that work, but I've definitely looked at it quite a bit with hatred and a stern eye. When I've been to, like the SF MoMA and like maybe like LACMA and stuff, and even though I feel like I've been kind of very compelled to make work that speaks to my identity politically. I'm very enamored by minimalism, so I'm sure that if it wasn't Carl Andre, it could have been somebody else. But other influences also, like Louis Bourgeois and Eva Hess have been like really big part of like what the work that I look at. Ana Maria Maiolino is another person that I've been looking at a lot recently. But back then, yeah, I think Bruce Nauman is a big influence of mine, but there's also other like female performance artists like Valley Export and Linda Maria Montano that I really look up to. um, yeah, I mean, like Bruce Nauman, when I worked at the Shrine, I was exposed to his work like quite a bit when I was there. So definitely, yeah. Carl Andre, yeah, I mean, it's bricks. They're bricks. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? If not, I have one question.
Mhm.
Oh, Vincent.
Vincent, yeah.
Hey, Dia.
Hello.
So I was just, I'm impressed by how fluid your work is. Like you kind of move between different mediums. You didn't show a lot of your performance work, but I love that stuff too. And I'm just wondering, you just went through this whole application process for your MFA program. Did you feel like any pressure to kind of, I don't know, stick to one medium or only show one medium? Or do you feel that pressure in your art practice to kind of, I don't know, specialize in anything? I mean, I feel like right now with like Instagram culture and all that, we have to have like a signature, right? Or a specific medium or a style that we work within and are known for. I'm just wondering how you navigate that in your work.
Yeah, I think I do have that. I have that conversation quite a bit, actually. Like, I feel like one of the first times that I had that conversation was in one of the artists, Law and Savage, when we were talking about Basquiat, and people were talking about how, um, how people have to have like this one style because then it's easier for curators to market your work. And I think that it's just like the art environment is so different now, and there's so many of us that are not either hopeful or dependent on gallery representation, that becomes like lesser of a question in that realm. But then, like you said, in social media, it's like this whole like marketing branding thing. I just feel like I've never really been able to be so consistent in one aesthetic, I guess. When I have a conversations about that, when I feel like, oh, my work is all over the place or blah blah blah, and then I ask people, and they're like, no, like when I see your work, it's like seems pretty recognizably as your work. So then I kind of just stopped worrying about that. When I was applying for grad school, I did have a lot of hesitancy for including certain works just because they were so outside of the realm of everything else that I was displaying. But I think that it depended a lot because every school has a different way that they want the portfolio submitted. So they have like their own different rules. Some of them seem more welcoming to video work and some are less welcoming to video work. Some of them don't want you to put detail shots at all, and some of them welcome detail shots. Some of them want 20 artworks from the last 2 years, and some of them are like just only include works from 1 year, and then some of them are like 3 years. So it just really depended on the school. But I did include a lot of the panel work on paper, and not everything, but I included a few significant ones that I really liked. And I was scared that they were going to be like, oh, this is too two-dimensional. But then I met some of the people that are going to be in my cohort, and one of them is a painter and it's a sculpture program. So I was just kind of like, I guess it didn't really matter that much. I think ultimately the work is just changing as it changes, as it should, and I'm not that worried about like having this like one brand of thing. But I think that that's also one of the reasons why I've been taking a break from performance, because I feel like people were really kind of putting my work into this kind of like performancey thing, and I had some issues with like the voyeurism of people just wanting to see the nudity and then like not really quite understanding it, or like not having the appropriate audiences for it. And like I didn't want everybody to just invite me to things because of only performance when I was doing all these other things. So it's been like a struggle back and forth. It's a conversation. It's still an ongoing conversation. Yeah. Do you feel that? Do you feel like people want you to make a specific work?
I feel that pressure all the time. I'm like, oh my God, my work changes every day. And is that terrible? Should I allow myself to grow and experiment? I don't have a brand that anybody can identify with myself anymore. I'm not consistent, but I feel like the work needs that, at great risk to my career, the work needs that.
Yeah. But I mean, also, if you think about it, like, how can our generation be like that when we look at thousands and thousands of images every day? Like maybe somebody in the 60s and the 50s could make work that was really consistent because they were just exploring this one thing. But not now. We just have so much information, not only visual, but also just like everything that we're like receiving, that it seems like impossible that if you're receiving so much that you can only want like put out this one specific thing, you know? So yeah, it's a difficult thing to focus on one.
I also think the grass is always greener because as a painter, I'm actually having the opposite problem where I'm feeling like I need to get off the canvas and I need to make work that isn't on a canvas. So it's funny to hear you two say that because I'm like, can I get into your mind? Because I'm trying to stop painting and make
Yeah.
different.
And that makes so much sense, you know, because when you're a sculptor, I mean, unless you're really like a glass person or like a ceramic person, like when you're a sculptor, like everything is your medium. So it can be overwhelming and it can be ever changing, and you can always just have this new material that you're exploring, and that can lead you all these different multiplicity things. But yeah, I feel like I don't feel like the pressure of that as much anymore. I feel like right now I'm just like doing whatever I'm doing and it's fine. Yeah. But I'm sure like maybe next week I'll be like, oh my God, everything's like a mess. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Okay, I have one last question if you don't mind. I was kind of wondering what comes first, the idea or the making? Like, do you make something and then attribute what it's about after, or do you think about what you want to say and then pick the medium that's going to say that? Or is it a combination?
Yeah. I think it's a combination. I mean, like for the paper, I was just like, oh my God, paper, it's so cool. It's like got all this texture and stuff. And then I was like, well, what do I want to say? Like, what do I want to use the paper like? And then I started like, you know, collaging it and putting flowers on it and then cutting things and putting them on there. And like collage is such a like good exercise just in general, visually. Like if you know, if I don't have anything to do, I'll just like cut up some things or whatever and put them together. But it's both. I feel like it often starts with like me exploring a new material or like this kind of new thing that I'm really obsessing over, and then after like lots of deep conversations with my partner and friends about it, sometimes I'm like trying to sleep at night and then I'm like, oh, this is how I can put them together. So like that's how the quilt like idea happened. I was like, how can I put all this information and how can I use paper? And then I was like, quilts, like that's something I'm fascinated with. Meets a format of like multiplicity into one, and like, you know, I can make with paper. So it's a combination of them all. Yeah.
Is there any last questions? All right, well, I want to thank you so much for you, Aida, for coming here today. And I also really want to thank our audience for being here. You've been amazing, and I feel very lucky. This is our first talk, and it went very well, and I feel very grateful. I also want to encourage you to come to our next talk, which is Thursday, the last Thursday of the month, April 29th. And it will be Chris Frazier, and he actually graduated from Sierra College and is now the head of photography at Cranebrook. So
Oh, wow.
It was another great school. So Aida, hopefully you can come too, but please everyone share the news and please come for that talk as well. We'll be also sharing information about that through email. Well, thank you very much, everyone. It's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.